I've asked a few people to come up and just share a few of their own, somewhat informally, here on the panel of why this matters for the nation. So if I could ask Jeannie Scott and I forgot who all I've asked to come up here. Kay Husband's Feeling, Galen Carey, Stephen Lerneau. If you could come up now and take a seat up here on the panel. And while you're doing that, I want to make announcements. There's always announcements at conferences, right? All right. One such announcement is that we have giveaways for you out front. You've already heard from other organizations that have giveaways, but we also do, the DoSER program has a table out front, or will at the reception, where you can pick up your own copy of the choice work guide that was used at these workshops across the country. We have a book that was produced years ago by the DoSER program of the AAAS before I became involved with the DoSER program, but it's still a very popular book. It's called The Evolution Dialogues, and it's really designed, I think, for high school teachers and churches and families where there is some struggle with how to integrate an evolutionary picture of science into a faith perspective of people in their classrooms and families and in congregations. And so this book, even though it long predates me at the DoSER program, it's still very popular. We get requests for it all the time. And so we're giving them away here as well. And one of the editors here, the main editor, is Jim Miller, who I think is with us today. Jim, are you here in the areas right there? So thank you very much, Jim. And by the way, we also have a very special guest here today, a guest participant. I think I mentioned earlier in the program that this year we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of this DoSER program, of the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program. There have been 3 directors of this program throughout its 20-year history. Audrey Chapman was the original director, and then Connie Burtka for years, that built up the program to the point where I could take off with it and do some of the projects that we're enjoying now. And so I'm really pleased that Connie Burtka is with us here today. So if you'll raise your hand, or yes, so Connie, we're very grateful for all the good work that you did when you were directing DoSER, and your good work carries on and is blossoming now thanks to you. So we appreciate that. We're going to celebrate during the reception with some DoSER-ish refreshments. I don't know what that means, but we're going to find out. Okay. What else? I've lost some of my announcements. Oh, so the reception will be out at the pavilion. I think that's where we had lunch, right? So yes. So the same place we had lunch is where the reception will be. And we're asking the members of the advisory committee. You know who you are. If you've been on the advisory committee for this project, could you just stay here for a few minutes after this session is over? We want to get a photograph of the group. Okay. Did I miss any announcements? Okay, good. Now, back to the sublime and the deep thinking here. I would like to ask these folks to share a little bit from their perspectives about why this matters, if I can find my notes, which are now completely disheveled. I'm trying to find, nope. All right, well, we're going to have to improvise. I've asked these folks who represent different realms of the conversations we've been having today to reflect for just a moment on why they think, if they do, that this dialogue between scientists and religious communities matters for the health of science and for the health of the nation. All right, so we have Galen Carey representing the National Association of Evangelicals and evangelicals in general. We have Jeannie Scott from the National Center for Science Education, who can speak to science education in the country and the perspective that many scientists have in this nation. We have Kay Husband's Feeling, who is, I've lost your affiliation, but is the head of the public policy School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. And so, but Kate, more than that, Kay Husband's Feeling has been involved in many science policy groups, working groups, leadership councils for the AAAS and other organizations around Washington for many, many years. So she's here representing, I think, the perspective also of science policy. She's an economist and has a kind of a global science policy perspective on this whole issue. Stephen Lerneau is the chair of biology at Emory University in Atlanta. So we're glad that you're here and can comment from your perspective as a leading scientist. And of course, we've heard from Bill, but if there's conversation between you, if there's time, that's good too. So could we just go down the line here and see your reflections kind of on a national perspective of whether and why this dialogue actually matters. Galen, do you want to begin? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think Dr. Phillips' very profound comments really stand on their own. I'm not sure that really need to add too much. I was particularly struck by one thing which he said, which is that if we do not learn how our two communities can work together, that this will erode the health of our country. And that reminded me of one of the NAE's primary themes, which is the health of the nation, and the document that outlines our basic principles of civic engagement. And that, in turn, I think is very much parallel to the AAAS slogan of serving society. So we have, in many ways, overlapping missions. And I just want to share two quotes from evangelical leaders that I think highlight our sense of that, how that mission is. First, from William Temple: "The church is the only society that exists for the benefit of those who are not its members." Maybe it's not the only one, but that is one of its distinctives, is that we exist for others. And then Dietrich Bonhoeffer: "The church is the church only when it exists for others. It must tell people of every calling what it means to live for Christ, to exist for others." So in many ways we have overlapping constituencies. That is, the church exists to serve, among others, scientists. And science, in turn, exists to serve, among others, people of faith. So we share the common mission or overlapping missions. And so respect and partnership need to characterize our relationships if we are going to each fulfill our respective callings. And to do that with civility, with respect, with humility, and a spirit of listening to one another seems very important for not only for science or for faith, but for the health of the nation.
Thank you very much, Galen. Jeannie.
Is the dialogue between science and people of faith necessary? Absolutely. These are two very powerful institutions. Science is a very important economic as well as cultural institution in the United States. It has a great deal of respect in among the United States population. All the poll data, that's the good news. They really like science. And clearly, when you've got an institution to which 90+% of American citizens adhere, some aspect of religion, mostly Christian, you've got two institutions that that need to talk to each other, particularly since, as Bill pointed out, there are tensions between them sometimes very sharp tensions between them. Not to get all postmodernist on you, because if there's one person in this room who is not a postmodernist, it's going to be me. But there is, to some degree, a competition for cultural reproduction, if you will, where there are conflicts between science and religion. Both of these two powerful cultural institutions are very concerned about whose views get passed on to the next generation. And this involves education, which is one of the reasons why I got interested in this topic. So yes, it's extremely important that science and religion communicate, that they get to know each other better. But obviously, these are overlapping groups as well. Scientists may be religious, they may be non-religious, they may be anti-religious. People in the faith community may be scientists, they may be completely uninterested in science, and they may be against science. So you have lots of combinations, very varied groups. The good news is, in terms of this dialogue that everybody here is interested in, is that the biggest set of these combinations is that basically Americans really do like science. And that's, I think, something we can build upon.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll add my comments. Agreed all around, and the comments that have already been made. Is this dialogue or the conversation between scientists and Christians and other people of faith, religious communities, is that important? Is it necessary? Is it useful? Is it critically important here for our nation in terms of science policy? That's the area I'm supposed to actually address, and I think the answer obviously is yes, at least in my view. And the reason is that we have a common value. When I talk to my students in the science policy courses, and I talk to different science policy communities here in the US and abroad, one of the questions we often ask is, well, what is the benefit of all of these expenditures on science and the activity of science? And they usually come back and say, well, here are some of the outcomes we really care about. And what are those outcomes? We care about national security. We care about food security. Internationally, we care about that. We care about the environment, and we heard earlier sustainability. Those are critically important to the science policy community. We care about a big term, social well-being, and people usually gesticulate like this because it means a lot of things all put into one. But one of those areas is oftentimes health, and we care very much about health and the quality of life, especially as we're living longer. We want to also know that that extended life has a high quality and a high enjoyment for our well-being. And I actually have asked my students that in a science policy class, and these are some of the things that they've come back at me with. We actually care about knowledge and knowing new things. We care about those things. I see common value there. I am a Christian, but I also am a social scientist. I'll say social scientist because there are natural scientists in the room, and we also want to make that clear as well. But I feel very comfortable in my own skin, and I feel very comfortable thinking about these outcomes as shared values, as common values between the religious community as well as the scientific community. So the first thing that comes to mind is this concept of the outcomes. The second thing that comes to mind is this concept of participation. And the fact is that we are participatory in this process of developing new ideas, and participatory in many ways, some of us actively in science, but some of us in terms of just the contributions that we make financially. We actually do support the scientific mechanisms and organizations and scientific output, R&D, those types of things with our contributions and tax dollars and things like that. So just in terms of that support and the support that we also know about in terms of does the general population support science? And the answer usually is very much yes. And are they interested in the outcomes? The answer is typically yes. And so I think in terms of outcomes and participation, we have a common value. And the last piece of this to me is the future and thinking about going forward, how are we going to keep this conversation going? And on whom are we going to rely on? And I guess I come back again to my students and even my child and I think the kids. And they need to be able to understand that there is this common value. There isn't this polarization between having to choose a religious community or the scientific community, that you can actually exist in the same and that there are some common values that we share. So those are my perceptions. I don't think that they disagree at all with everything we've heard before, and is that comfort level and that idea of the common value that I wanted to put forth from my own perspective.
Thank you very much.
So I haven't heard anything that I disagree with. Let me just say that people like myself who are practicing scientists, we depend on your support, both financially and otherwise. I think in a general sense, scientists are held in high esteem in society, but you can be an educated American and know very, very little science. I'm a scientist. I'm expected to speak the English language well. I'm expected to know something about history and politics. The converse isn't true. And I fault us as much as anybody else. We do a not-so-hot job in educating the public about what we're up to, and we need to do better at it. And one of the reasons that that's the case is because the approach that we've used, I think, for disseminating science to people, including the evangelical community, needs to be rethought. We need to emphasize the fact that what we call facts and science is based on inquiry that is grounded in experimental approaches. And at least in theory, everybody in this room can do experiments and verify the things that we call facts in science for themselves. One of the things that they'll find out is the experimental approach is messy, it doesn't work all the time, and that it frequently requires mathematical skill in order to interpret the outcome. So this is the challenge, and then we're trying to take all this and distill it down and talk to people in religious communities. It's just sort of not surprising that there's a struggle in order to convey that information. Meetings like this have convinced me that this one-on-one dialogue, although it's hard to imagine doing this on a national scale, taking this and sort of blowing it up a millionfold or something like that, maybe that's the challenge that we face. And what we ought to start doing and have started doing with this approach. So we depend on you, and we should do a better job in selling what we're up to. And we're not at a threat for what religious communities are trying to do. It's in many ways a non-overlapping set. We tend to emphasize the fact that there's overlap, but there's also a substantial amount that are in two different spheres. And I think we should respect and understand that that's the case, and in fact celebrate that that's the case. There's nothing to be threatened by. So I guess I'll end on that.
Thank you. I want to ask the panel, kind of follow up on what you said. How do we reproduce this a millionfold? I mean, how do we go from here? This day of dialogue has been rich and diverse, and the topics that have been brought up, and this whole 3-year project that this conference culminates has been interesting, and we've had these regional gatherings and surveys and so forth. But how do we actually foster better dialogue in local communities, in science institutions, in congregations, in local cities? How do we foster better interaction beyond what we did today? Any ideas across the panel, or what do we do from here? What would be some next steps that you might recommend?
Well, I'll just make one suggestion that I've made in our various regional meetings that we've held this past year. If you are a scientist, why don't you take a pastor to lunch someday and just sit and chat? And if you're a pastor, why don't you invite a scientist, not necessarily even one from your congregation, but someone in your community who you don't know, and take the opportunity to build a personal relationship. And perhaps that then can be the foundation for organizational or institutional linkages.
Any other thoughts from your other spheres of influence and experience about where we could go from here?
I think an awful lot of it has to do with education at all levels. One of the things that I heard a number of occasions at this meeting was that there are people that genuinely fear sending their children to universities because they're going to have their brains contaminated by all this alien scientific thought. I think what needs to occur is we need to do a much better job in educating and sort of I don't know what the word is, de-threatenizing of I think I just coined a new word. Yeah, de-threatenizing science so that people of faith will have their children exposed to authentic science involving real experiments, or as they're growing up and learning about their faith, and that these two things will be in parallel. The education that goes on in science, and particularly elementary school and especially in middle school, leaves much to be desired. There's national angst about the fact that so many students are lost, quote unquote, lost from science when they're in middle school, because people just they're not getting as rigorous and exciting an exposure as they need to. And I mean, I think that there would be less need for us to do this if all of our children had been exposed to science continuously while they're developing their faith, and that the two can coexist, and we should do a better job with the next generation.
Thank you. Kay, is there any perspective from these national policy groups that you've sat on? Are they hearing about the science interests and concerns from religious communities? And would that make a difference? I mean, is it
I would say that in the U.S., and even in the areas that I've gone to abroad and talked about science policy in various panels, the dialogue on religion or religious communities and science or scientists, that does not come up that often, I have to say. And there are some instances where it's really clear that science is science and beliefs are beliefs, and never the twain should meet, or at least be discussed. And so having smaller discussions, I think, among colleagues over, over something that's not like this, where you feel like on the spot and the lights are in your eyes, is probably a little, easier, a nice environment in which we can have a dialogue, a discussion, a conversation. But I would say I don't hear that as much in the policy arena. But I think in academic institutions, you do have more opportunity to have dialogue, even across people of faith from different faiths. And that's something that happens often enough. And we are in a scientific community just by the fact that we are in an academic institution. So that does occur. But I have to say I don't see that as often at all.
okay?
Sorry.
Thank you. Any comments of our panelists that you have toward any of the other panelists' thoughts or comments, or any final reflections? I so want to open it up to Q&A from the audience, but I'm so time constrained to not allow that. So I do think I would like to be optimistic in the sense that at least I sense enthusiasm for scientific exploration and discovery and the good uses of science for the betterment of the world across the board. For people who are people of faith and people who do not identify as people of faith, from scientists and non-scientists. Of course, there's also a lot of apathy out there too. But I do sense that there's a lot of interest as well. And I do think that science is common ground. Science itself is a common ground for the nation to kind of come around and join hands in support for the good things that science brings to everybody. And as long as we're able to kind of talk about it in such a way that everyone can benefit from, I think that will be a benefit to the whole nation. So, yes.
Yeah, you asked the question, anything that we've heard so much, but one thing that struck me just in the last few minutes was a term that I heard, intellectual curiosity. And I did not see any real tension between intellectual curiosity and faith. I don't see that tension. And so that was encouraging for me. That was an opportunity. That was a plus for me to think that they don't necessarily have to be in opposition, intellectual curiosity and faith.
Yep. Okay.
Just
Yes.
one last thing, the proceedings of this dialogue, which are going to be made available online, is something that we could all share with colleagues who weren't able to be here, and that's another way that we can keep this dialogue going and even expand it to others.
That's right.
It's always easy to start where you agree. And we agree that science is a wonderful source of answers for many of the world's problems that scientists and other people as individuals are concerned about dealing with, whether they are religious or non-religious. I have not seen evidence, in fact, all of the survey data that we have shows that conservative Christians, mainstream Christians, Catholics, other religious people are science fans. Everybody likes science. Science is a good thing. I want my kid to study science and so forth. Except for some sciences. And it's really easy to, talk about the areas that we agree, but at some point we have to sit down and talk about the areas where we don't agree. And where the science community, which consists of about half religious people and half non-religious people, or people who don't care, and a certain small amount of people who are really anti-religious, who make a lot of noise, but I don't think they're especially representative. And you can kind of understand why religious people would get a little testy when they're being told by that smaller group of scientists that they are somehow defective in their philosophical understanding, their life choices, et cetera, et cetera. You can sort of nobody likes to be kicked in the shins. It's not persuasive. Similarly, you have people from conservative Christian faiths who are making statements about nature that really get scientists to dig in their heels. It's very hard to support scientifically that Grand Canyon was cut by a large body of water. I mean, there are things like that that come up that we have to disagree upon, and we have to figure out a way. How do we? It's an epistemological issue. How do we answer such questions as, how was Grand Canyon cut? If one set of explanations is very disruptive to one set of religious views. So that's something that's in the future.
Okay.
That we have to deal with.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all of our panelists. And I especially want you to all go back into your own spheres of influence, whatever they are. We talked today about the scientist sphere of influence, the media, the congregational sphere of influence, and the public in general. And think about ways where you and your sphere of influence can be somebody that fosters healthy dialogue and discussion about science and its role in our life and our greater sense of values in this country. And that's what we hope we fostered today. So thank you to our panelists and to all of you. And let's go have a reception in the pavilion. We've got 2 hours to dialogue and eat and drink and enjoy each other's company. All right? Thank you.